Welcome everyone to the 10th meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. We have apologies today from Ross Greer, MSP. Before we proceed, I'd like to thank the SPCB staff for facilitating what is our first remote meeting. I would also like to ask that members be patient should we encounter any technical difficulties. This is the first formal meeting of the committee since the introduction of the lockdown restrictions put in place to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the committee has met informally and we have agreed a number of changes to our work programme as a consequence of the pandemic, and I thought it would be helpful to summarise these on the record. Principally, the committee has agreed to issue a call for evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on the culture and tourism sectors. We will take evidence today from the Cabinet Secretary for Tourism, Fergus Ewing MSP, and next week we will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for culture, Fiona Hislop MSP. In subsequent weeks we will take evidence on the future relationship negotiations between the UK Government and the European Union, and the committee will consider our work programme further in private at the end of today's meeting. As a consequence of the changes to our work programme, the committee has agreed to postpone our external affairs inquiry for the foreseeable future. The committee's website will be regularly updated with details of the committee's future work programme. Our main item of business this morning is an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism on the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's tourism sector. And I'd like to welcome to the meeting Fergus Ewing, Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Tourism, Bettina Sizeland, the Deputy Director of Tourism and Major Events with the Scottish Government, and Duncan Mackay, Sponsorship Manager for Tourism and Major Events with the Scottish Government. In a moment, I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement. Because of the challenges of managing a virtual meeting such as this, we are going to take questions in a pre-arranged order. Once the Cabinet Secretary has made his opening remarks, I will invite members to ask questions and then I will invite the Cabinet Secretary to respond. I will go back to each member and back to the Cabinet Secretary for any follow-up questions in quite a formal way. Once completed, I will invite the next questioner and so on until the evidence session is concluded. I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. And finally, I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before you ask your question or provide an answer. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask that if you wish to bring your officials in to speak, that you state this and allow a couple of seconds for officials to be brought in. And I'd now like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement of up to 3 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to members of the committee, and many thanks for this invitation this morning for myself and my officials to give evidence. Without question, the situation that's facing Scotland, and indeed most of the world, is without precedent in modern times. Over these last 40 days or so of lockdown, our overriding priority in the Scottish Government has been the preservation of life. And in addition to that, to, as far as we can, suppress the impact on our NHS, impacts which in other European countries we have seen has been massive and hugely problematic. So those are our primary objectives, Convener, and those objectives have meant and required that we have had to introduce measures which restrict liberty, freedom and our movement, which are indeed without precedent. It is absolutely clear to me as the Cabinet Secretary responsible for tourism that the impact on tourism has simply been devastating, and there is essentially no tourism in Scotland at the current time. We have also had to ensure that we have swiftly and effectively, working with the UK Government and indeed other devolved administrations throughout these islands, put in place measures to provide financial support to businesses that are facing a sudden loss of income, which is total, devastating and unprecedented. So we work extremely hard, and I emphasise we have done so of necessity at speed in order to help businesses be able to survive and navigate this extraordinarily difficult period, a task made more challenging because we cannot say with any certainty how long the duration of the restrictions will be required for. I'm no in doubt at all, Convener, that the various support streams that we have put in place in Scotland and the UK government has put in place will be continued for some time. And indeed, should they be required to be phased out, as eventually they must, that process in turn must be a gradual one, because I think that the recovery for the tourism sector will not be quick, it will be slow. It will be a long period of recovery, and we have to prepare for that. We are regularly reviewing the physical distancing restrictions, which will be amended only in line with medical advice. So at this stage, it's not possible to say what measures will be put in place in the near future, nor how they will affect the tourism sector. The distancing measures are a matter of public safety, and they've been implemented on the basis of the evidence and expert medical advice. So going forward, public health in Scotland will continue to be the priority, and any relaxation of measures will and must be informed by the advice of medical experts. Convener, as you know, the Scottish Government last month published the COVID-19 coronavirus, a framework for decision making. This is part of our effort to inform and listen to the people of Scotland, and this hearing this morning is indeed part of that. And this document outlined our principles and our approach to managing our way through and out of this crisis to a new normal, if you like. On the 5th of May, we have published an update setting out further information about the challenges Scotland faces, and this provides illustrative examples of the steps that might form part of the initial changes to the current lockdown restrictions. This paper sets out some options that we are working on, both in terms of assessing their impact and on the practicalities of implementation. And I am working closely with our public agencies and with the tourism sector as a whole to look at this, so that we will be ready to make changes when the evidence tells us, Convener, that it is safe so to do. Thank you very much, and I and my officials look forward to answering questions that you and your members may have this morning.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for those remarks, which will certainly very sobering and in many ways very depressing, but very honest. As you say, the health is the priority going forward. But as we know from our short inquiry so far, the statistics are pretty devastating. As the Scottish Tourism Alliance's survey found that 88% of their respondents said that their business or income had entirely disappeared. And as you alluded to, the situation around the world is equally bleak. I believe that there's 75 million jobs in tourism around the world threatened, so it's not just here in Scotland. I know that you have been having regular meetings, Cabinet Secretary, with the Scottish Tourism Alliance, which is very much appreciated by the sector, and you're very well aware that one of the big asks from the sector is help for larger businesses with a rateable value of over 51,000 who so far have not been eligible for grants. And I'd like to thank you for your letter to myself and the committee outlining the help that you've given to the sector so far. But in that letter, you mentioned that you were continuing to have discussions with Nigel Huddleston, the Tourism Minister in the UK government, with regards to help for those businesses over 51,000 rateable value. And I wondered whether you were able to give the committee any update on those discussions and whether that particular sector of the tourism industry is likely to have any good news in the future, because as you said in your opening remarks, this crisis isn't going to go away for the tourism industry anytime soon.
Well, thank you, Convener. And yes, I have been working very closely with the Scottish Tourism Alliance Their leadership from Mark Crothall and Stephen Leckie has been exemplary. Most recently, I had a regular conference call with them yesterday, and I have been working with them in order to see that the kind of medium to larger businesses in Scotland in tourism, hotels in places like the Borders and Fleece and Galloway, in the area that you yourself represent, convener, hotels throughout rural Scotland, whose rateable values exceeds the threshold for grants of 51,000, are effectively in the position of having rates relief and having access to the CBILS, the loan scheme of the UK government, and that's welcome. But many of these businesses are businesses that have been built up over decades by families, by individuals who may be now towards the end of their own working life, perhaps in their late 50s or early 60s, and just not relishing the prospect of taking out a loan of £500,000 to pay back the government for another 10 years. And I do think there's a fundamental unfairness that these businesses do not get grant finance as automatically businesses with a lower rateable value do. Now, I don't mean this at all to be political, because we've been working at speed and we've tried to leave the party politics outside the room, and I think that's frankly what is wanted of us. And therefore in Scotland we have, through the funds that we have set up, administered by the enterprise agencies, South of Scotland, Highlands and Islands and Scottish Enterprise, we have made sure that these businesses will be able to apply for support. But, convener, I do think that at a UK level that there should be a recognition that these businesses have fixed costs. Every month they have to pay substantial amounts of money without grant finance that smaller businesses have. I do think that there is a disparity, therefore, between those businesses simply on the basis of rateable value. And I have urged Nigel, the Tourism Minister in Huddleston, the Tourism Minister in the UK, with whom I have a good working relationship, to urge the Treasury to fill that gap. And in that respect, I've been working alongside my colleague Fiona Hislop, from whom I understand you'll be hearing this next week. What is their response? As yet, we haven't had a response. But you know, let's not be too pessimistic, because to be fair to the UK government, they have made changes to their furlough scheme. They have made two changes to the CBILS, one to extend it beyond £45 million company turnover, and the other to grant effectively the bounce back £50,000 loans. So they have been willing to change there. My ask is that they change here and have a UK scheme. Otherwise, and I apologise for the length of this answer, but it's a very, very important point, convener, which you rightly raised. Otherwise, I do fear that we will see the loss of the most valued hotels in just about every major town, rural town in Scotland and Britain unnecessarily. And I think some of the money that has been, if you like, earmarked by the guarantees granted by the UK government CBILS could perhaps be earmarked instead for enhancing the grant scheme. And in that respect, the SDA have provided evidence, which I've sent on to the UK government, of what these overheads are from any companies, not only hotels, but visitor attractions and many other companies. There's coach operators as well. And therefore, we are continuing to work very hard to try to secure the objective of helping these businesses navigate these dreadful times.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that extensive answer. And I have also read the helpful suggestions from the STA as to how these ongoing costs can be met. And it's good to know that you've passed it on to the UK government, and we can only hope that there will be some good news soon. As you said, this situation is going to last a long time. But we have to hope that there will be light at the end of the tunnel, and I was pleased to see that the Visit Scotland is heading up the Tourism Emergency Response Group, STERG, which is looking at a national action plan into how we deal with the situation now and how we look forward to the future. Clearly, at the moment, as you say yourself, health is the priority, and a very strong message is going out, in particular in rural areas like the ones represented by yourself and myself, that we do not want people travelling to these rural areas at the moment. But going forward, and the point has been raised by the STA, that we're going to, once things assume some kind of normality, that message is going to have to change, because it's been said that staycations are going to be the future of tourism, so people will be travelling perhaps around Scotland. But there is the issue that in rural areas, the people who live in those rural areas are very concerned at people coming to their areas. And that point was raised by Emma McQuillan of the Caravanning Club in the STA. She says there's a need for clear and consistent messaging as measures start to be lifted, that recreational travel in a private vehicle is safe. Is that something that at this stage you've given any time to, any thought to, in terms of how we can get those messages out in future?
Yes, thank you, Convener, and we have, because obviously, as Tourism Minister, I'm absolutely keen to see the restrictions lifted, but only once it's safe so to do. And we should and must and are using this time to prepare the way for the lifting of restrictions. And that work involves many people. The STERG committee, that's the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, chaired by Visit Scotland, are doing good work. The Scottish Tourism Alliance, but many individual organisations are also working very hard. The SLTA, the Caravan and Holiday Park Association, wild tourism organisations, various visitor attractions. What they're doing, Convener, is to analyse how their business could be run differently. How do you run tourism attractions in a way that keeps people safe? This is the intellectual challenge, but every organisation is working to have recovery plans put into place, ready to be put into action when it's safe so to do. And in that task, I think, Convener, there's a number of objectives, and you have absolutely identified the key one. The key one is to reassure the public that this is safe, because, as you say, at the moment, there are, in many parts of rural Scotland, a number of people who are very worried about an influx of people that do feel, listening to the evidence from the First Minister and the Interim Chief Medical Officer and the Health Secretary, that now is not the time to be lifting restrictions, that the message of stay at home is the correct message and should be observed by us, subject to the recognised restrictions which have been agreed for exercise and shopping and necessary things of that nature. So it's absolutely essential that we use this time to build up a basis of how businesses will react, making sure that safety of the public is the priority. After all, I mean, what is the tourism sector for? It's to give people an enjoyable time away from the working life, whatever it is, to have a vacation with their family. They want to be happy, they want to be safe, they don't want stress, they don't want to be worried, and they don't want people whom they encounter in the place that they visit to feel uncomfortable either. So these recovery plans are absolutely essential, and I'm spending quite a lot of time in discussing some of the details of these. And I have to say that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of businesses, from hotels, caravan parks, visitor attractions, coach operators, they're taking this very, very seriously indeed. They're responsible, reputable, and this work is absolutely essential. And there are some other specific things. For example, we may require more flexibly to respond to the needs of business. For example, caravan holiday home parks have restricted licenses on the on-trade. If it is safe at some point, Convener, and only when it's safe to resume the operation of licensed premises, then the restrictions on these licenses may be something that local authorities would be keen to flex, and that in turn would require a bit of pre-preparation. I just mention that as a sort of an example of a specific point where working together in Scotland as a team we can keep the restrictions now, but work and prepare for the recovery. And the last thing, I'm very sorry for the length of this answer, but these are really such crucial issues. The last thing I would say is that, with the unlikely event of aviation as we knew it resuming soon, or even possibly by next spring, staycations will, I think, be extremely popular. And there's therefore many people who are cooped up in flats now will obviously want to enjoy a holiday as soon as they possibly can. And we have to consider, and we have to kind of manage the foreseeable scenario where, the first weekend, the road from East Loch Lomond from Drimmen to Ben Lomond is jam-packed because everybody goes to the most popular areas. So we have to think about that as well, and these practical issues, the provision of public toilets and lavatories, other services, all these things we need to kind of plan in advance so that when the restrictions are lifted, we can enjoy a staycation in Scotland.
Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary, and I think everybody is looking forward to when we're able to focus as a committee on that recovery in tourism, and we'll certainly be scrutinising it in the months ahead. Thank you very much. I shall now move on to Claire Baker to ask her questions, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. The first question is just around a matter of clarity. While it is important that we talk about preparedness for the sector reopening, the immediate concern is about survival of the sector to get through this, what would traditionally be the peak season, and for there actually to be a tourism sector left at the end of this. The Cabinet Secretary talked about support for businesses that were over 51k rateable value. Is he referring to the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, which I do understand the government has recently doubled, so it's now a 90 million fund. But I also understand that fund had to close to allow for analysis of applications. So the question is that fund being accessed by the tourism sector? Does he have any information yet about how much support, or what percentage of support even, the tourism sector is able to get from the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund?
Well, thank you, Claire Baker, for that question. First of all, the Pivotal Fund, it's called PERF, is available for businesses with the rateable value in excess of 51,000 to apply. There are criteria to that fund, but it is available, and I know that some tourism businesses have already submitted applications, and I've discussed this process at length with my officials in South of Scotland Enterprise and Highlands Enterprise on Monday of this week, and they were working over the weekend, and their staff to start to process the applications. They're taking this very seriously indeed. But my main point, Convener, is different. My main point is this: that I think there should be a UK fund, which means that these businesses with rateable values of over 51,000, like those under 51,000, are entitled to some grant finance. And that's the gap. We've tried in Scotland to fill that gap using PERF, but it nonetheless is a gap. And it's not too late for the UK government, as I've urged Nigel Huddleston, to change. We're all recognising that these decisions taken so swiftly are bound to see gaps exist. Let's not be political about this. Let's be practical. Let's try to get the support out to businesses. I don't want to see any business fail to survive because they couldn't pay the fixed overheads at a time when they've got no income. I think that's the fundamental unfairness. Now, the worry in Scotland, of course, is that no matter how much money we apply to PERF, and we've doubled it since it was set up initially, because it's so important, Ms. Baker, that it may not be enough to meet demand. I'll be quite candid about that. That the impact on business is so devastating. And I countless meetings with representatives and individual businesses, that unless the UK recognise that this is a need, then my worry is that no matter how effective PERF may be, it may not be able to be sufficiently well resourced to meet all the legitimate demand. And this is not to defray all loss of profits or income. That's not what it's about. We can't have overcompensation, but we do need to provide a bridge to enable these companies to survive. And this could not be a more serious task, convener. And that's why deliberately I'm saying that, this is not a matter of party politics. This is a matter about survival of businesses that have served these islands well for decades. And now business, having bankrolled Britain for some time, government needs to bankroll business for a little while longer.
Thank you. I don't underestimate the challenge that is facing the Scottish Government and the UK Government in supporting the tourism sector, and it will be a really difficult time. I also wanted to ask about self-catering accommodation, which I previously asked the Cabinet Secretary about at virtual questions. You will know there's been some frustration around the grant that is provided through local authorities, and there's been a call for guidance to be reissued. The Association of Scottish Self-Caterers initially said only 4% of businesses had access to that support. I understand it's now gone up to just over a third, but there is still some concerns that there's a postcode law today that local authorities aren't giving out the grant in the same way across the country. And the second issue, which you will be aware of, was some concerns around the criteria that was attached to the grant funding, around 140 days having the property let. And I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could respond to those concerns of the self-catering accommodation sector.
Yes, thank you for that question, Claire Baker. And in a moment, after I've given a short answer, I will ask Bettina Seislin to come in and give a little bit more detail about local authority performance. But we are working with our local authority partners who are administering the grants based on the non-domestic rates, either of 10 or 25,000. We initially restricted the grants to one per business. However, we recognised that might cause hardship, so we extended the system so that the grants would be per property rather than per business, but at a slightly lesser level than down south at 75%. So instead of getting 10,000 for a second or third property, there would be 7,500. Instead of 25,000, there would be £18,750. And that was a Scottish decision taken to avoid what we consider might have been overcompensation. So we're working with local authorities. Their performance, convener, is published in a publicly available table, so it's transparent. And I think that's a pretty good incentive for those local authorities that maybe need to perform a little bit better to do so, and I believe they are. But I'll ask Bettina, if I may, to cover the detail of that, because I haven't got the table in front of me. The other point I would make is that the 140-day rule is causative of concerns. I spoke yesterday to Fiona Campbell of the Association of Scottish Self-Catering Properties, and we're still engaging with her to see if there's any possible way of amending the current conditions. However, they were put in place because we felt that they were fair. And let me just make one point. The point was we didn't want just to compensate people who basically have a second holiday home, who may let it out to people for 10, 20, 30, 50 days. We didn't want to do that. But in England, there's no such restriction. And one estimate says that in England, £550 million has been paid out to people who have vacant second homes in coastal towns. So, there are risks here about overcompensation, and we have to be mindful of these, convener. I wonder if at that point I could perhaps pass to Bettina Seislin to answer in more detail the first part of the question which Claire Baker asked. Sorry, I can't hear him. Yep. Yeah.
That's it. Apologies. I thought I was on, but I was still on mute. So thank you very much, Mr. Young, and good morning, Minister. You asked for a bit more detail on the local authority grants and the variation between the different local authorities. And as Mr. Ewan said, we do publish those results so that it's completely transparent. That is information that we can submit afterwards in more detail as a written response. It's fair to say that there were initial variations. Local authorities have been working closely together in a steering group to make sure that those anomalies are ironed out and that they're more consistent in their approach. So hopefully we should be seeing an improvement in the way that grants have been accessed. Just to say that in terms of overall figures, as of close of date on 5th of May 2020, local authorities reported 71,000 applications, and of those 53,765 had been processed and 621 million awarded. So the system is working, it is improving all the time, and we can provide a written response on the detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Gordon Lyndhurst to ask a question, to be followed by Beatrice Wishart. Gordon.
Thank you very much, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you've rightly focused on the crisis currently facing Scottish tourism and the businesses involved. Of course, prior to the current situation, some referred to what they thought of as the opposite problem, that of over-tourism in city centres like Edinburgh, and different issues that arose across Scotland to do with Airbnbs, hotel capacity, local residents and their situation. And I think everyone would accept there's a certain balancing exercise to be carried out on these things. And I'm just wondering what consideration the Scottish Government and you have been giving to getting that balance right as we move forward, hopefully soon, out of the current crisis, as well as supporting businesses, but also addressing issues that we're all aware have been there.
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Lyndhurst. And our thoughts are turning towards planning for recovery, as I've mentioned earlier. I have to say, Convener, and be quite candid here, my primary focus at the moment is on helping businesses survive. I think it's right that that should be the case. If it is the case, as I know it is, that there will be people watching this programme whose livelihoods have been utterly destroyed and who at the moment are uncertain as to whether or not to restart the business, I think the primary task is to focus on that. And I think as politicians, we have to distinguish between what is merely important and what is absolutely essential. So, I have to be quite candid, Mr. Lyndhurst. This hasn't this question of the balance between what some people describe as over tourism and what we have at the moment is not something that is occupying my thoughts at the moment. And I don't mean to be critical of the question in any way. It's a perfectly fair and valid question. But just at the current time, my efforts really are focused every day and in countless discussions which are necessary with business leaders and in the third sector and many charities involved, businesses that are part of the panoply of Scottish tourism, visitor attractions of the whisky experience, the Highland Wildlife Park, the Edinburgh Zoo, the Royal Yacht Britannia, numerous forest leisure facilities throughout the country. These businesses are really facing the question of survival, because in many cases, particularly those businesses reliant on international visitors, it's anticipated that there really won't be a 2020 season to speak of. That's the worry. And if that comes to pass, then, the financial gap is not a few months. It takes us into next spring, sadly. And I don't want to be over pessimistic. I'm by nature an optimist, but I think the current time, I think my focus really should be on working to try to get the package of support as right as we can to fill the gaps, to persuade the UK government, and I hope they're listening to this, that there really is a need to do a bit more for these family businesses in Scotland, and the medium size I've talked about, that have paid hundreds of thousands of pounds in every case to the Exchequer, to the local authority rates, in all sorts of taxations and levies. So that's where my focus lies. In due course, I think, Mr. Lyndhurst, we'll turn to that and work with the industry on these very important questions. Thank you.
Perhaps I could follow that up. You've talked quite rightly, the focus is on saving and assisting businesses at the current time. And specifically, I'd like to ask about coach operators. There are coach operators across Scotland, including my own region of Lothian, that have contacted me, and I know this issue has been raised before. I'm wondering if you could give an update on what the Scottish Government is doing to assist Scottish coach operators, who indeed are the backbone of certain parts of the tourism industry, and what specific measures have now been managed to be put in place by the Scottish Government to help these companies who are, as you say, facing very difficult times and potentially business collapse.
Well, thank you, and I'm pleased that you raised this important issue. And I had a fairly lengthy conference call on Monday with coach operators with the Association of Passenger Transport that represents them, and a great many of them, and there could be between 200 and 300 companies around Scotland, have lost either all or most of their income. It's a low margin business. There tend to be significant overheads in respect of each coach, which may cost between £250,000 and £300,000. There are loan charges in respect of that, and the cost per day are fairly substantial. The provision of coaches, as Mr. Lyndhurst said, is absolutely essential for a large number of areas of tourism. It greases the wheels of tourism. It allows people to get to and from the airport. It allows visitors from cruise liners to go on tours of Scotland. It provides for visitors from America, from Germany, from Japan, from China, a luxury experience. These are high quality vehicles, operated very professionally, very often in conjunction with tour guides and tour operators, cruise lining companies and others. So the point I'm making is that if we don't have a coach sector, we don't have a complete tourism jigsaw. We don't have the whole provisions that are required to be a successful country providing enjoyable vacations for visitors. And moreover, there's another point, that if social distancing is to be the norm, and that seems to be the case for the foreseeable future, then fewer people will be able to travel in coaches. And that raises one, questions about the viability of the business on low margins. But number two, whether or not the coach operators' vehicles will be required in respect of public transportation. If more vehicles are to be required because each vehicle can only take a quarter of the passengers that formerly were accommodated by each coach. So I think it's important that we understand just how important the coach sector is. Now, what should be done about it? Well, I'm seeking a meeting with the UK minister who has particular responsibility of this, and that's in the Transport Department, I believe, not Nigel Huddleston. And I will be putting it to the UK that serious consideration, should be given to a bespoke package for coach operators. Because without coaches, there isn't no effective tourism in many, many ways. And therefore, that work is a very serious piece of work. Meantime, and I finish with this, and I do apologise for the length of the answers, but every issue it tends to have quite a lot of complexities. And the last thing I would say is that I do believe coach operators will largely be qualified for the PERF, the PERF scheme. But the question then is whether there will be sufficient funds in the PERF scheme to meet all the demand. And I fear that that is probably not the case. So if the UK government wishes to respond in this particular way, then working in partnership together, I think we could come up with a scheme that would assist the challenges, very serious challenges, facing coach operators throughout Scotland and the UK.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I'd like to invite Beatrice Wishart to ask her question, followed by Annabel Ewing. Beatrice.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I very much appreciate and welcome the comments that you've made, particularly around businesses with the rateable value of 51,000 who are falling through the gaps, and certainly the word survival has been used in representations that I've received from hotels in Shetland. According to Visit Scotland, businesses might survive an average of 3 months without support. I mean, as we leave lockdown and go into the long winter, it might be the nail in the coffin for those tourism businesses who rely heavily on the summer months. So in your discussions with the UK government, I wonder if any thought has been given to introducing a 12-month support package to tourism and hospitality industries to tide them over to the next season.
Well, I think Beatrice Wishart is absolutely right that the problems facing our tourism sector are not ones that will be over in 3 months' time, in most cases. And the worry actually is that they may not be over in 12 months' time. I should say that I do welcome the UK government's extension this week of the furlough scheme to October, and I think that decision was necessary. And moreover, I welcome the flexing of that scheme so that from July there will be an ability to flex, because that's a real issue for many tourism businesses that, you know, may need people to do a little bit of work in maintaining a property, security, checking property, a bit of ground maintenance, helping out with refunds, helping out with particular work. And I think many employees would like to have that flexibility. You know, people working for a business for 20, 30, 40 years miss their working life and want to make that contribution again. So as far as the specific idea she puts of a 12-month fund, this is not something we've considered as yet. I think, Convener, I think the first thing is to focus on tackling successfully, assuming that can be done in this world, this virus. And we're, of course, observant of what is happening in other European countries like Spain, where they are now seeking, I believe, to lift restrictions. And we will be watching closely how effective these measures are. And we all hope, of course, that they will be effective, because that then would give an evidence base. So what I'm saying is, I think we should give a little bit more time, personally, to see the measures in Scotland that the First Minister is driving forward are given a chance to be effective. And hopefully within a period of weeks, not months, we can see some progress which may allow the lifting of restrictions, provided it's safe to do so. The last thing I would say is that, you know, as someone who's for I think 5 out of the last 6 years holidayed either in the Orkneys or the Hebrides, I have to get to Shetland on holiday, Beatrice, sometime. You know, I'm acutely aware that the season for holidays in our islands is short, and the ferry restrictions add another air of a lovely part of a holiday, but another kind of level of cost. So there are particular issues that concern the islands, and that's why myself and Paul Wheelhouse have had a couple of conference calls with Beatrice Wishart and colleagues representing islands in their constituencies, including, of course, Mr. Gibson in your committee this morning, because we recognise there are particular challenges on the islands and a real worry that there may not be much of a 220 season at all. So that's something that we must continue to do, to work very carefully with Island Council representatives and their parliamentary representatives.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I look forward to welcoming you to Shetland in the future, and I hope it's not too far away. You actually touched on something there in our talks about other issues to do with island. It's about the ripple effect on other industries, but it's across Scotland. Many wholesalers have lost more than 80% of their trade as the pubs, restaurants and cafes and hotels that they're used to servicing have closed. and many of these businesses are still without support and experiencing severe cash flow issues. So is the Cabinet Secretary considering any specific support for wholesalers in Scotland, and might business rates relief be extended to cover wholesale businesses?
Well, I should say, Convener, that I shouldn't give the impression that I haven't visited Shetland. On many, many occasions I've had the pleasure to visit Shetland, always in connection with work, sadly, and I've had many, many better meals in the Shetland Hotel than I've had in the fine restaurants of Brussels and Paris and London, I can tell you. But answering the question, yes, the member is absolutely correct. The wholesalers face particular challenges, and we have discussed some of these in relation to issues about supply of food and provisions to the islands, to ensure that there is equity of supply, that our retailers, the largest and the independents as well, are able to supply your constituents that live in the most remote parts of Scotland to have the same access to a range of food and supplies as everybody else. And wholesalers fulfill that purpose, and they're facing particular pressures. Now, I understand that in working with the Wholesalers Association, that very closely with them, that several of their members' companies, Convener, have received support from the funds that are available, but I'm also conscious that some haven't and face very significant challenges, particularly with the loss of the on-trade, as Beatrice Wishart points out. So that is, again, work in progress, and the aim is to help these companies that are a sort of hidden part of Scottish life, but without wholesalers, who supplies the schools, the hospitals, the clubs, the pubs? Where does it all come from? Well, wholesalers are the suppliers of food and provisions and refreshments to a whole range of bodies. Without them, we have another serious gap in provision for tourism and for public servants as well. So I'm very pleased that your members are raising all these important points. I'm so sorry that the answers have inevitably to be of some duration.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to invite Annabel Ewing to ask a question, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In the briefing that the Scottish Tourism Alliance provided helpfully for our committee deliberations this morning, they made the claim that around 2,500 businesses were unable to access any form of grant support. Now, obviously, some of that will include those with rateable values over 51k that we have already discussed, and some will include the self-catering business issue, which already has been discussed. But I just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would be aware of any other particular gap that would need to have to be considered carefully as to how that gap could be met, and if there's a further role for Visit Scotland and others, and indeed membership tourism organisations, to ensure that their membership is aware of actually all the many funding heads of claim that can be made, to ensure that if there is a potential eligibility, people are actually applying for what they would be entitled to receive.
Well, thank you. And yes, I think there are still various gaps, and we've covered, I think, pretty well so far, Convener, some of these thanks to the questions that your members have chosen to ask. And this is not the first time that Ms Ewing has asked me questions, but it is the first time that she's asked me questions in the Scottish Parliament Committee. But seriously, another gap I think that there is this, that quite rightly the UK government set up a scheme for support for the self-employed. That scheme had various restrictions. It's now open, incidentally, and self-employed people should look to the UK website for the details of it. But it's restricted in certain ways for people that have been employed for a certain length of time. The Scottish Government set up a separate scheme for self-employed that hadn't been employed for that length of time to fill that gap. But in addition to that, one of the gaps which exists is that many people who effectively are self-employed are trading in the format of a limited company. And my understanding is that thus far this is a type of business which hasn't been accepted as qualifying under the self-employed scheme, because, if you like, a legal purist view about self-employed is taken, where someone is not taxed under Schedule E as a company director, but is taxed as somebody who derives their main income from self-employment rather than having an employee. So this is another particular gap. But the overall desire, I think, between the UK government and ourselves is that we need to fill these gaps. That's the thing. It's not to be precious. It's not to stand on ceremony or admit that we get everything absolutely right all the time. That's just not the case. The important thing is none of that. The important thing is to fill the gaps so far as we can, to avoid overcompensation, but to make sure that we provide sufficient compensation. And that's why I have very regular meetings with Mark Crothall and his members of the STA, and will continue to do so, along with, of course, Fiona Hislop and Kate Forbes. We work pretty closely as a team. We have economic cabinet meetings every Friday, as well as the conventional cabinet meetings on a Tuesday, because of the need to focus in on these particular problems right now and give that, the vast amount of our mind, time and effort to try to fill these gaps. Because, in 40 days, we have enabled an awful lot of businesses to survive. We have, collectively, and that's good. But it's not good that there are these people who have been left behind, and that's not good at all. So that, I think, is increasingly the focus over the next couple of weeks to try to make sure. And some of these businesses will undergo enormous financial pressure, and I recognise that, and I want to say that to anybody that's watching, which is why, if you like, some other issues that Mr. Lyndhurst mentioned about future policy are simply not in the top of the in tray at the moment. Thank you.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and it is encouraging to see that there is indeed a determination and willingness on the part of the Scottish Government to work closely to see what can be done to ensure that those who are in receipt of nothing, that some help can be provided. And I guess also MSPs have a role in that regard as well, to bring any anomalies to the attention of the government as expeditiously as possible to see what can be done. The other issue I would like to ask about is the important issue of recovery, and I know that has been touched on earlier in our deliberations. And I have 2 points. One is, I wonder to what extent, and of course it's early doors, and I do appreciate that the focus has to be on getting through the first phase of the pandemic, but I just wonder if not yet, perhaps it would be appropriate to look at what other countries are doing who have not dissimilar markets from Scotland in terms of tourism, in terms of climate and activity and all the rest of it, and beauty and so forth, and wildlife and everything. And I just wonder what cognizance will be taken of how other similar tourism markets internationally are proceeding or intending to proceed. And the other issue I would wish to raise is, to what extent would it be a help if the VAT rate or the successor to VAT were to be reduced going forward for the tourism sector?
Well, thank you. And I think, firstly, yes, we should obviously look at what other countries are doing. I should say that Visit Scotland, ably led by Malcolm Roughhead, are doing work around international comparisons. We do need to see also what steps they take in terms of restrictions, how they do it, and how they fare. So that's absolutely essential. You're right also that MSPs and MPs are very important in the role of pressing, frankly, myself and my colleagues to fill the gaps. So I welcome engagement with every parliamentarian and try to do our best to respond to cases that you rightly raise in working hard for constituents, whatever party or part of the country or parliament you may represent and sit in. And yes, you're also right that we do need to focus on recovery. That is the only other real issue in tourism that we are looking at the moment. Once it's safe to do so, we must be able to reassure the public that it is safe and that practices which weren't in place before will be adopted precisely to ensure public safety. And I think there's preparatory work to prepare the mindset of people prior to lifting restrictions. I think we need to get some effective messaging out, but only, I stress, when it's safe to do so. I hope I've answered all the questions there, Convener. If I haven't, I may hear about it later.
Thank you very much. And now invite Kenneth Gibson to ask a question to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. A very interesting meeting so far. I think it's quite obvious that as we move forward, the likelihood of people being able to take the foreign holidays they once did will be much diminished, so staycations will be increasingly important. However, we have to have the attractions for people to go to, and yesterday at First Minister's Questions, as you may recall, I raised the issue of the National Trust for Scotland, which of course has attractions ranging from Culloden in your own constituency to J.M. Barrie's birthplace, Robert Burns' birthplace, and indeed Brodick Castle in my own constituency. And at the moment, the National Trust is threatening some 429 redundancies because its income is down 28 million. It's lost 46 million in terms of its stocks as well, and it's basically struggling to survive. So what can we do to try and ensure that we have the attractions as well as the jobs that they provide, and of course the important contribution to Scotland's heritage that the National Trust would provide?
Well, again, Convener, another extremely important question, and Mr Gibson is correct that the National Trust is the steward of some of the finest heritage in Scotland and indeed the world, and some of the reasons why people come to Scotland. Lots of the more modern countries in this world don't really have the heritage that we have going back centuries. So our castles, our centres, whether it be Bannockburn or Culloden, our magnificent gardens, these are national treasures. And I was saddened to hear of the decision the National Trust took on the eve of the well-trailed extension of the furlough arrangements. So I should say, Convener, that this matter is being dealt with by Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop, my colleague, and my understanding is that a meeting is to take place between her and the National Trust fairly soon, possibly tomorrow, where I'm sure these issues will be discussed, because obviously the frontline staff of the National Trust are the public face of Scotland, and their courtesy, their professional approach is part of what makes a pleasurable experience to the Culloden Visitor Centre in my own constituency or any of others. So I very much do hope that we can see some progress in the situation with the National Trust. On the wider issue of visitor attractions, yes, I think this is one of the really big challenges now, is working with visitor attractions to try to ensure that they are able to navigate this crisis. And that's why I've met with Gordon Morrison and Susan Morrison, who represent ASFA, the Association of Scottish Visitor Attractions, on a couple of occasions, and I'm continuing to engage with them, specifically to home in on issues that affect visitor attractions, which are slightly different from some of the other parts of the tourism panoply. Thank you.
For that, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, I appreciate it's Fiona's remit, but of course you have a kind of overarching remit, I suppose, with regard to rural Scotland, because tourism touches so much on it. And I think what is interesting is, of course, that with tourism, that we got figures from Spice which said that whereas Highland has the highest proportion of jobs in tourism, 15%, even West Lothian, which is the lowest, still is 5%. So it really is an issue that touches every sector. Now, one of the things, we've discussed a number of things. For example, you touched on self-catering. I think there is an issue, though, that we haven't really managed to get out to all sectors, that in this crisis, the support that is available is about ensuring that organisations, businesses actually do survive and are able to re-establish themselves once we get through this current crisis. And I think there is a real issue about them believing that the taxpayer, if you want to put it that way, it should be involved in income substitution. And I think we need to clarify more that no, if a bed and breakfast is lost, as one of mine claims to have done £2,000 a week, that somehow the taxpayer should be replacing that amount of money. And I think the message has to be more about we're here to ensure they survive and ultimately thrive, without burdening them obviously with debt, but not to try and replace every penny of lost income. I think that's something that we need to perhaps re-emphasise a wee bit more. Would the Cabinet Secretary agree? And just one final point. He did touch on infrastructure. I think what alarmed me was that last month, we mentioned this on our island discussion a couple of weeks ago, but what alarmed me was a couple of weeks ago, the Caledonian Isles, for the umpteenth time this year, broke down. Now, if we had a normal tourist season, that would have caused chaos on the island of Arran, and I'd have been inundated with dozens of irate emails, quite justifiably, from islanders in the tourism industry who'd have been losing income. So what do we do to ensure that when we are up and running, that we have the infrastructure ready for that? Because at the moment, I have real concerns that will be the case.
Well, briefly, Convener, first of all, yes, the financial packages should provide, if you like, a bridge to cross the gap, to navigate these difficult times. A sufficient financial support to meet outlays for which there is no income to meet on a business basis. And I used to run a business myself, so in one sense, it's a straightforward situation. It's much more difficult to make sure that the schemes devised fit everybody. Secondly, you mentioned bed and breakfast. They were a gap initially, Convener, because they didn't, by and large, they weren't registered in the rating roll, and therefore we have filled that gap. And legitimate bed and breakfast now can access assistance. I thought it just useful to make that clear to any that are listening. There's a distinction between those who are running a proper B&B business, who are serving people as their main business, and Airbnb on the other hand, which we can't really provide a lifeline to Airbnb business, people who are deriving their income from other main sources. In relation to the ferries, Mr. Gibbs is absolutely right that these are not only lifelines for the residents on islands, but also the gateway for most visitors to islands. Air travel is relatively limited to a relatively small proportion. And therefore, we are obviously mindful of the need prior to recovery to make sure, so far as we can, working with Caledonian McBrain and their partners, that we can ensure that staycations can be had in the many beautiful and magnificent islands that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite Oliver Mundell to ask a question, to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener. I wondered if I could ask the Cabinet Secretary, in terms of the National Trust for Scotland, whether or not the Scottish Government will make it known that there's strong feeling that they shouldn't make those employees redundant or start that process until October, given the support that was outlined this week from the UK Government. And secondly, whether he recognises that when it comes to their outdoor rural assets, such as the Greymare's Tail, just outside or on the edge of my constituency, that their land management role is really important, particularly at this time when people are trying to use outdoor spaces, and outdoor tourism is likely to be one of the key selling points for Scotland as we look to recover.
Well, I thank Mr. Mundell for that point, and I think he's made his view clear about the decision that the National Trust took. I think I did say that I was saddened to learn of that decision, and I alluded to the fact that, as far as I recall, the decision was taken on the eve of the announcement by the UK Government regarding its furlough extension to October, and moreover, my recollection was that the extension of the furlough scheme, although made the day after the National Trust announcement, was well trailed. It was not unexpected. Now, these are matters for my colleague Fiona Hislop to pursue, but I think it's helpful that members have expressed concern in this hearing this morning, convener, and I very much hope and expect that the Chief Executive of the National Trust for Scotland is listening to this exchange, or will consider it very carefully indeed. So that's obviously pressing business. I think I would like to say that I did, in my discussions with Nigel Huddleston prior to the furlough extension announcement, argue this point, that many businesses now were, prior to this announcement, actually pondering whether to go ahead with redundancy. I mean, some businesses have payrolls of up to 2,000 people in Scotland. And they were worried that with no furlough extension, what were they to do? I don't know any big business that is not absolutely solicitous for the welfare of their employees and extremely concerned to do the best possible thing. But my argument to Nigel was, look, we need this furlough announcement very soon, because if not, businesses have to take decisions, in advance of when the money runs out. They can't wait for various practical reasons to do with employee welfare, redundancy process. So I did make that point to UK government, and it did appear to make some effect, because the announcement did come through, fortunately. But the months ahead will probably see sadly, more announcements of redundancies, convener. This is why the task that we're all working on is so very, very important, and why we hope and urge every employer to behave as responsibly as they can. And that obviously applies to the National Trust for Scotland.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. It's very helpful, and as he says, I hope they are listening. And I agree, we're very lucky to have the UK government furlough scheme and to have that extension till October to give people time to plan. In terms of a follow-up, I wanted to ask about the 140 days and where that number had come from, because certainly my experience in Dumfries and Galloway, where the tourism industry is maybe more fragile than in other parts of Scotland, 140 days can be very hard for people to achieve. And I've got examples of businesses locally who it is their primary and sole income in some cases, but they fall just short of the 140-day requirement. And it's whether there's likely to be any additional flexibility there. And it's I understand that there isn't an infinite pot of money, but how these businesses that are bringing people into our region cannot be caught, just seems so wrong, and people are very, very worried and frustrated. And I know there is reasons for the difference with the UK system, but people are particularly frustrated in Dumfries and Galloway, where they look just the other side of the border and see people who are not running comparable businesses getting money that they think they should be entitled to.
Thanks, Mr. Mundell, for this question, which was raised by Claire Baker earlier, and I gave an answer to that, and I'll try and answer the question that Mr. Mundell has now raised. First of all, I think I should make it clear that self-catering properties that are subject to business rates qualify for the grants of 10 or 25,000, and that they are also eligible for business rates relief as if they're rated, as most of them indeed are. Secondly, I think Mr. Mundell does make a fair point. The reason, as I understand it, why the 140-day rule was put in place was to ensure that the financial support went to legitimate self-catering businesses with a track record, to people for whom it's their main livelihood, and that's the point that he made in the examples that he gave. It was also mindful of the fact that we also had to try to give support to those who are self-employed, to those in the creative sector, to bed and breakfast who weren't getting any rates relief at all or any grants whatsoever. And therefore, the fact that we shows this criteria of 140 out of 365 days was designed to allow us to extend financial support to fill gaps of other businesses that would not otherwise have got a penny piece. No rates relief, no grants. That said, as I said earlier on, we're looking to consider whether there is any room for being more generous or not. And that question in turn, I think, convener, will ultimately depend on the overall financial situation, to be quite candid. Will we have in Britain enough money to achieve what I think we all agree is the purpose? That's not, as Mr. Gibson said, to pay people for their profits or loss of profits and restore things to the status quo ante, but to allow businesses to bridge the gap. There is, as I understand it, complete unanimity amongst the governments that this is the objective and not overcompensation. How that's done is always a matter of judgment and balance. So I very much hope that if the UK government, for example, were to accede to the requests that I've made now, convener, for support to the above 51,000 rateable value businesses, to self-employed people who are self-employed but just happen to be trading as a limited company for very valid reasons, that then would allow us to perhaps to extend support to others who have a deserving case. And I would, of course, say that, Mr. Mundell, if he wishes to send me any individual examples, then I will look into them myself.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Stuart McMillan to ask us questions.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, earlier on today, you touched upon the issue of social distancing, and whether it's social distancing in the bars and restaurants and cafes, or whether it's with the coach operators, as you also touched upon. But clearly, it will be a hugely challenging issue to deal with. And I'd be grateful if you can provide some further information to the committee just regarding the what planning or what's in the consideration thus far in terms of the optimum level of, or the restrictions of the optimum level of incomes that many businesses may potentially face in this particular area.
Well, Stuart McMillan is quite right to raise this because, of course, one of the major challenges facing the tourism sector, in particular the hospitality sector, is how can pubs, restaurants, cruise liners, other places where people congregate quite closely together for social intercourse, how can this be operated in conjunction with compliance with the COVID rules? Now, a lot of work is going on in this respect. The British Hospitality Association, I've advised, has 8 different streams of work looking at 8 different types of property. I've also observed that I think in Spain, the Costa del Sol bars were reopened the other day, and I did see in the newspapers people taking advantage of that with a 2-meter distance rule applied. But that, of course, was for outdoor licensed premises, something that in Scotland is not always a compelling attraction, although perhaps more can be done in future to explore opportunities there anent. But the main challenge, I think, convener, and Stuart McMillan has identified this, is how can these businesses be operated in a viable way economically? If there are to be fewer customers, then how can this work? Now, I am with Jamie Hepburn, who, when we have shared responsibility for the hospitality sector, to liaise with the hospitality sector as a whole about this. We have already had discussions and also with the SLTA, and I've had many discussions with them as a member of the Scottish Tourism Alliance, but we are specifically going to be engaging with the hospitality sector. I think it's recognised that, when restrictions are lifted, that they will not be in the first order. We're looking at some outdoor activities first, but it is right that we prepare the way and we work with the sector to see how restaurants and pubs in particular can be operated safely. And that piece of work, as I say, with industry is ongoing at the moment. And I'm very pleased that I've had the opportunity to say that we welcome the professional approach being taken by the SLTA, the Tourism Alliance, and all the other bodies that realise that the primary thing is to protect their customers. The safety must be paramount, and that message is absolutely accepted, and that's, I think, a good thing and necessary for me as Tourism Minister to welcome and recognise on the part of industry.
Yeah, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. And I know in talking to some of the facilities and businesses in my constituency that the huge challenges that are there in this particular area, and certainly this summer and certainly autumn, there will be missed opportunities, particularly when it comes to weddings and functions, which can certainly be a huge economic driver for businesses, and certainly help them tide them over the winter period. So I thank you very much for that. And that second question, Cabinet Secretary, it's regarding the information I've received from the Scottish Tourism Alliance, and that this probably isn't an issue for yourself or the Scottish Government to undertake directly, but I would be grateful if it's something that you can take up with the relevant people, including the insurance industry. Certainly from the survey that they have produced, one of the stats that really stuck out for me was that 92% of businesses have inadequate or no relevant insurance. Now, in 2008 we had the financial crash. This year we have COVID. Who knows what will happen in the future? So I would certainly encourage certainly the Scottish Government, UK Government, and all relevant bodies and partners to have that dialogue with the insurance industry, so that there can be potentially better protection for events in the future that may actually have a less of an effect upon the public purse if we do have to come across something like this again.
Well, thank you for that question, and indeed the insurance is obviously important for any business to make sure that there is adequate insurance in place, and that's trite advice. I think there's a point well made, and part of Mr. McMillan, and I know that insurance for events is a complex area. There's a question about whether the premium is a justifiable expense if it is very expensive in relation to the risk. I think just the only other point I'd make, Convener, is that there are many businesses that may be watching this hearing that have paid their premia for business interruption insurance, paid very handsomely business insurance for precisely the event that they're facing, that they lost their business because of an epidemic. And they're now finding that in many cases, the insurance companies are not paying out. They say that they have a loophole. Now, these are private matters of contract, and we must respect that is the case. But I do think that insurance companies, who I think are taking a test case, and I think the FCA have an involvement here, so this is a reserve matter. But I do think actually it would be very helpful if the Prime Minister were to say to insurance companies, look, this is private contract, but all of us have got an obligation to respond to COVID as part of our social contract with the country to show that we care. I've spoken to businesses that were on the verge of tears because they paid handsomely for years, thousands of pounds, to insurance companies. And now, when they make the claim, they say it's the wrong sort of pandemic. You can imagine, Convener, they're not very impressed with that answer. Neither am I.
Thank you very much, and I'm not very impressed with it either, and I have a number of businesses in my constituency who are similarly affected by the insurance companies, and thank you for that very clear message to the insurance companies. We have a little time in hand because members have been very disciplined in asking their questions, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, also for your succinct answers on occasion. We do have a little time in hand, so I'm going to bring in Claire Baker, who would like to ask another question.
Thank you very much, Convener. It is back to the issue of looking at how the sector can restart, and I note that in Spain, the Minister of Industry, Trade and Tourism, they published a list of good practices for the tourism sector in terms of reopening. So it's just, would the expectation be on the sectors to bring forward the guidance and proposals for reopening, or would the expectation be for the government to do that? And if it was the sectors, would the government look at some way of endorsing what the model would look like? And has any thought, sorry, it's quite a long question, has any thought been given to how that could then be monitored or policed?
Well, it's a very good question, and my feeling here, I'm not sure that we've got an absolutely defined prescriptive policy on this, but my view, and I've now, I think for nearly 10 years, had an economic responsibility in the portfolios that I've held, is that we should work very closely with industry at all times, and that the best policies, the best outcomes are where we work in partnership and collaboration.
We appear to have lost the Cabinet Secretary. If you could just bear with us a moment, we'll see if we can get him back. I'll just have a brief pause. Hello, welcome back to the meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. I'm sorry we lost the Cabinet Secretary temporarily there. Cabinet Secretary, you were in mid-flow answering Claire Baker. Would you like to conclude your answer?
Well, I would like to, but I can't remember precisely the question. So I wonder if Ms. Baker could kindly repeat it.
Thank you. The question was about guidance, about whether the government or the sector would be expected to provide the guidance and how it would then be monitored and introduced.
Right, of course. Well, the guidance, I think, should be produced jointly with the benefit of industry's knowledge of the precise circumstance, and then informed by the Scottish Government's analysis of the evidence with regard to protecting public health and safety. So I think these things are best done as a joint effort, and that's the way it's done in my responsibilities in farming, in forestry, in tourism. I think that's the best way to do it, and the objective, of course, is to reassure the public, but also to set out a safe system of work, irrespective of whether it's tourism or other areas of economic activity. As far as enforcement goes, well, you know, I think we've all got a duty to respect the law, to respect the guidance. I think that's first and foremost. Obviously, there are certain matters which are criminal offences. For example, the provision of hospitality for at the moment is covered by the emergency legislation. And there are other matters where it's a matter of just doing the right thing as individual citizens. Where there are clear abuses, obviously, we can bring these to the attention of the Scottish Government or even the police in certain circumstances. And I think as MSPs and MPs, perhaps these are things that on occasion we're asked to do, and we should weigh up our own responsibilities to ensure collectively as a country that we can respect and provide public safety.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And that concludes our questions and answers in this evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for taking part in the meeting and for members for participating in the committee's first remote committee meeting, which went fairly smoothly apart from that technical hitch at the end. So thank you all very much. We now conclude the public part of this morning's meeting and we can move into private session. I allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break before we resume that private session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.